Jalagisiwonihi. Do you speak Cherokee?
Sio, Tohiju. I hope you're doing well. How are you? You can see that I'm drinking from my red cup. It's my red alert cup for today for a controversial letter, or at least the way that I present it. I've had some people not really be on board with it, but I'll explain why I use this the way that I do. This is the nasal sound. This is the character that represents the nasal sound in black. I like to think of this as a candle, and I like to imagine that this is a sage leaf that's about to get burned. And I reach for it, and then I say, uh-uh. Now the is probably one of the closest sounds in English to the nasal sound. We have 06, it's the sixth letter. It converts to SJ. Those sounds convert to sage, and that's why I use the sage leaf, and that's why I use this imagery, and I use the UNH for phonetic. Let me get into this a little bit deeper. This is a lot of information, but let's break it down. This is the syllabary character, like I just went over. It's the sixth letter. If you looked at this for the first time without knowing Cherokee, without having memorized any of the syllabary, you probably would not be able to guess that this was a nasal sound. Now this is the character, and it gets converted into the English letter, which is a lowercase v, which represents the nasal sound. If you were unfamiliar with this and you weren't taught this, you wouldn't know that that's the nasal sound. So you have to be taught that this is a nasal sound. You have to be taught that this is a nasal sound. Now, personally, I like my system, the Bickerdike Extended Transliteration. I use UNH. Now, that's not to be confused with UH or UN. I'll go over that later. It's UNH, and there's a specific reason for it. It's unique in the English language. We don't have anything like this. It's not common. UNH, it's unique. If we have UN, un. Okay, that's not a nasal sound, that's an N sound. Like duh, that's how you say it. That's not a nasal sound. I had to do something unique. And the reason that I did this with the H on the end is because there are sounds that are close to the nasal sound in English. Unger, hunger, gung ho, that ung sound. That's pretty close. It's not exactly the same, but it's pretty close. So if you take the ung sound, because most people don't really practice the nasal sound, they just say do a nasal sound. Well, what's a nasal sound? Well, listen for it. Well, what am I listening for? So I'm going to try to go over that the best I can. The ung sound. If you take the ung sound and you don't go all the way to the end, ung, that's going all the way to the end, ung. But if you stop before the G, or you remove the G, you can get pretty close to a nasal sound. Ung, ung. Now, the difference between that and an N sound, the N sound is the tip of your tongue in the front of your mouth on the top of your roof. On the front top of the roof of your mouth, your tongue will be on the top for a N sound. That's different. When we do the nasal sound, it's the back of the tongue closing off the throat area. It's closing it off. And then when you move your vocal cords, that vibrates up through your sinuses, and that's why we call it the nasal sound. Now, you're not going to hear that very loud or clear unless you're overemphasizing it, which most new people try to overemphasize the nasal sound, and that's fine. But that's why there's the difference between this. And instead of the G here, because we subtract the G, I take that out, I add something in its place so that we know that we're referring to that ung sound without the G. And I just put a silent H there. This is not an N sound. It's representing the nasal. That's why I do this. I don't use UN because that would be an N sound. Some people use this for phonetic. I don't use the UH because that is the sound. And some people use this for phonetic, but I don't. I think it's confusing. We already have a sound in our minds in English as English speakers. We already have a sound in our minds what UN is, un, and UH, I had to create a new one, ung. Now, this is not taking away from the syllabary or the standard transliteration. I still use both of these. I don't do any less than what the Cherokee Nation teaches. I just take it a step further for people like myself. Here's the culture shock. People who live in Tahlequah, people who live in the Oklahoma area, around the Cherokee Nation, they hear this sound all the time. They hear it all the time. Whether they're learning Cherokee or not, they come across it much more frequently than we do. It'd be like if we went to France and we heard the nasal sound all the time, even if we didn't speak French. So they're exposed to it more. In fact, there might be words like CO. That might be the only way they hear that word for hello. And then they go outside of Oklahoma and they go to an at-large group or an at-large meeting and they hear OCO, OCO. Well, it's a little bit of a culture shock. It's the same way the other way around. Anyone living outside of the Cherokee Nation boundaries in Oklahoma is considered at-large. We're at-large people. We're at-large citizens. And being citizens at-large, it's a culture shock for us because we're not used to this sound. We're not used to growing up with it or hearing it. So this is why, instead of just saying, oh, we'll just make the nasal sound, I try to take it a step further. This is how I taught myself, and this is how I'd like to show you what works for me. This is why I represent it this way when I'm using the phonetic to show you the breakdown of a word. Now, having said that, the nasal sound isn't always expressed fully. And that's why I made this little chart. If it's not really audible or if it's not really there, I'll put it in parentheses, or if you can barely hear it, I'll put it in parentheses to let you know that that sound is really not spoken, uttered, or heard, or that it's optional, that it can be. Now you can think of it like new moon, quarter moon, half moon, three-quarter moon, full moon, or you could think of it like a dimmer switch. If you're used to ever having experienced a dimmer switch for a light, then you can turn it to 1/4, half, 3/4, or full. You have to think of the sound, the nasal sound, you have to think of it like a dimmer switch. That's how I suggest you do it. And the range that you're going to find that most people will use that nasal sound is in the beginning, somewhere between 0, nothing at all, and maybe 1/4, maybe approaching a half, but somewhere in this beginning range. If you're saying it over here, that's good practice, that's fine, but you might as well wear a fluorescent yellow jacket with blinking red lights so that people can just know that you're a beginner speaker. Most speakers are not going to say it beyond this point, beyond this level. It's going to be more subtle. It'll be in the subtle range. Now, I think it's important to use all three, at least the first two. If you want to just memorize that these are the nasal sounds, that's fine. If you speak French and you're used to a nasal sound, it's very similar. It's more subtle in Cherokee. I went the extra step and used U and H. That's what works for me. It helps me identify the sound is separate from any other sound. And that's why I do it, even though there might be some controversy behind it. But this is why I wanted to develop a standard. This is my standard system. The B.E.T is my standard system. I talked about some of the other sounds with the E, O, U, the all the vowels. I went through the vowels with you in another video. But this is the way I do it specifically for the nasal sound. And I try to keep it consistent, and I try to keep it as a standard to denote this and separate it out so it's recognizable as being unique. Not to mix it up with UN, not to mix it up with an sound. There is no N sound in this. And once you've been taught, there is no N sound here, you have to be taught that, it's a nasal. There is no N sound here, you have to be taught that, it's a nasal. And there is no N sound here, it's a nasal. This is just the way that I write it. So hopefully that clears up anything for anyone who's raised around the sound, who's raised using only the syllabary and the standard transliteration. This is designed for the brand new person, particularly people who are at large, people who have no exposure to the speakers in Oklahoma and the Cherokee Nation. So I do have contact with speakers myself. Recently, I've developed more contacts, and these are the types of things I'm refining, but I do stick with this. I'm not going to change it. This is going to be my standard way to write this phonetically. I'm not taking away from the standard transliteration. I'm not taking away from the syllabary. I'm not removing these. I always include them, and typically I'll include all three. If I'm teaching, sometimes I won't do the syllabary, but I'll use this transliteration and the B.E.T. But I like to use all three when and where I can for teaching purposes. So hopefully that helps you. And we'll see you on the next video. Thanks for joining.
If you want to see more videos like this one, click subscribe and share this link with your friends. If you'd like to have all of these memory tips in one place, then in place of one fancy drink through a drive-thru, you can treat yourself to a Cherokee language book like this one, and then you can learn all 86 Cherokee syllabary characters at your own pace. Or keep coming back to this site for more videos, whichever works best for you. You can use the Cherokee Total R.E.C.A.L.L system to memorize an entire syllabary and more. Visit www.dpbickerdike.com to learn more.